Hi everyone! Tonight's video is on plant adaptations to land. So once upon a time, life existed only in the oceans. In fact, there wasn't even any soil on land. Land was just composed of rocks. Soil's composed of decaying plant material, and there were no land plants. The only plants were in the ocean, so there was no soil on the land. Sea plants were very primitive. This is a picture of what we think the original sea plants might have looked like. They were very small, probably single-celled or a few cells. They didn't need to store water. They were surrounded by it. And they didn't need roots. The function of roots is to absorb water by osmosis so it can be transported to the rest of the plant. Well, sea plants were surrounded by water, so they didn't need any roots. Sea plants also didn't need to be able to support themselves or stand upright. There was water pressure, and that kept the plants in the correct position. Finally, the male gamete of these sea plants had to swim to the female gamete. So what happens when this primitive plant moves to land? Well, it's not pretty. This plant is going to fall over and probably dry out. What adaptations does this plant need to survive if it moves to land? Well, land plants need a way to stay hydrated. They need a way to not dry out when they're not continually surrounded by water. Land plants need to be able to grow upright. They need a way to support themselves without the pressure of water surrounding them. They need roots to absorb water from the ground because, again, they're not surrounded by water. And finally, the male gamete needs to be able to find the female gamete without swimming if it's not in water. So the first land plant we see were the mosses. You can see the moss on this rock. It's a very small plant, and we tend to see it in very dark, cool, moist environments. It has a waxy coating to keep it hydrated, so this plant does not dry out. And it has tiny root-like structures that hold onto surfaces. They're like little claws, but they can't absorb water from the ground. They aren't real roots. They don't absorb any water. Moss lacks structures needed to support itself and grow tall, so moss tends to be really small, like a carpet that you see on rocks in moist environments. And most importantly, the male gamete still has to swim to the female gamete, so that's why moss is only found in very moist environments, very cool, dark environments. Typically, we see moss in shady locations that don't dry out and don't get a lot of sun. The next big step to moving on land were the ferns. Ferns, in addition to having a waxy coating so they were able to stay hydrated, they have structures that allow them to support themselves and grow upright. So ferns are much larger than moss. They also have true roots so that they can absorb water from the ground. But they're still limited to moist environments because the male gamete has to swim to the female gamete. So like moss, we typically see ferns in shady locations that do not dry out. So the land plants we've discussed so far have been able to live on land due to their waxy coatings and their roots, and in the case of the fern, their structures that allowed them to support themselves upright. But they've been very limited to moist environments on land because the male gamete is only capable of moving to the female gamete by swimming, and this really limited how much land these plants could colonize. So two major adaptations evolved 360 MYA. That's actually a unit, and it stands for million years ago. And these two major adaptations allowed plants to live far from water, even in desert areas, as pictured here. So we had pollen and seeds were our two major adaptations. So I'm going to go through each of these individually. Pollen is the male gamete of the plant. In the form of pollen, the male gamete can reach the female gamete by blowing in the wind. So you can see here, I have a picture of a flower on a windy day, and the wind is causing this pollen to be blown from the flower. That is the male gamete that is getting blown, hopefully in the direction of a female gamete. Plants with pollen don't need to be in a moist environment to fertilize and reproduce, and this was a huge adaptation that allowed plants to move far inland away from moist environments. Now, seeds was the other major adaptation. Seeds are actually embryonic plants inside a seed coat. Seeds allow embryos to wait until the conditions like temperature and moisture are favorable for further development. So let's look at a seed. What I have here is a peanut, which is, of course, a plant seed. On the very outside, you have the shell, and inside the shell of this peanut are two seeds. On the outside of the seeds, we have what's called a seed coat, which is a protective layer, and it allows the embryo to wait until the conditions like temperature and water are appropriate for development. So a seed that drops to the ground can wait for rain to come before continuing development, and a seed could wait for snow to melt before continuing development. If we look inside the actual seed, you can see this. If you take a peanut and kind of get your fingernail right in the middle and crack it open, this is what you will see. There is a large area of the seed called an endosperm. This is nutrition for aerobic respiration. Now remember, seeds are deposited on the underground, and then soil eventually blows over them, and so they begin their development underground. They can't do photosynthesis because there's no sunlight. So when the plant is first sprouting, when it's first beginning to develop, its metabolic process for developing or for making ATP is aerobic respiration. Because plants have both mitochondria and chloroplast, they can do both photosynthesis and respiration. So until a plant is above ground, it relies on respiration to make ATP. If you recall our inheritance lab, when some of the plants were white, some of the corn was white, they had no ability to do photosynthesis, but they were able to grow quite large because of the endosperm in the seed of those corn plants. It had plenty of sugars that allowed the plant to do respiration for quite a long time. Even once the plant was above ground, there were still plenty of sugars in the endosperm that gave it nutrition to make ATP. As soon as the sugars in that endosperm ran out, those white corn plants died because they had no ability to do photosynthesis. The other thing you see if you break open a peanut is this tiny plant embryo, and that is right here where you can see I'm circling the arrow. This is a partially developed plant in suspended animation. You can see the beginnings of leaves there and the beginnings of a root. It's ready to grow when the conditions are right, and when the conditions are right in terms of temperature and moisture, this seed will begin to develop, initially doing respiration using the sugars in the endosperm until the plant grows above ground and it can begin doing photosynthesis. So what's an example of a plant with a waxy coating, roots, the structures needed to grow upright, and seeds and pollen? Well, that's our gymnosperm. And I've pictured here a conifer, which is a type of gymnosperm. They're pine trees. So your pine trees have both seeds and pollen. Now let's look at where these come from in the tree. There are actually male and female pine cones in a pine tree. I bet you didn't know that. The male pine cone is what has the pollen. And if you can see here these small structures on the end of a branch, those are the male pine cone. And when the wind blows, the pollen blows off of that gymnosperm into the air in hopes of finding a female gamete. You can often see like a fine coating of orange or yellow powder on driveways and cars and sidewalks in the spring, and that is the pollen from gymnosperm that has been blown trying to find a female gamete. The female pine cone is what has the seeds. So this pollen is going to blow until it finds a female pine cone. The pollen would then fertilize the female gamete, and that gamete would then develop into a seed. So you can see here are individual seeds, and then this is a female pine cone. Each of these seeds has a little bed on the scale of the pine cone. If you look carefully here, you can see that each scale has a little bed for two seeds. Each of these seeds is an embryo in suspended animation. If we look at the size comparison, this is a picture of both the female and the male pine cone. The male pine cone is much, much smaller than the female pine cone. And the male pine cone, again, has the pollen. The female pine cone originally has the female embryo, or it has the female gamete that then develops into the female embryo once it's been fertilized. So once a female gamete is fertilized, the plant begins to develop and it's encased in a seed coat with an endosperm before stopping development to wait for the correct conditions to germinate, and that means to begin to grow. So what should you know from this video? You should know that moss was the first land plant, and you should know why it is limited to moist conditions. You should know that fern were the second land plants to evolve. They differed from moss in that they have roots and that they had structures that allowed them to grow large and upright, but they were still limited to moist environments. And you should know why that is too. You should know that the evolution of pollen and seeds allowed plants to move away from moist environments. Pollen is the male gamete, and it can reach the female gamete in dry conditions because it blows in the wind. Seeds are plant embryos that are in suspended animation. You should know the parts of the seed, and you should know that seeds allowed plant embryos to wait for favorable growth conditions. Gymnosperm are examples of plants with seeds and pollen, and you should understand that there are male and female pine cones on conifers. So that's all for tonight.